Tremendous. If we circle back to the comment you made about being in a high stress environment and being able to sort of switch off or take a different lens when you, for this example, you get home with the family, you're able to kind of compartmentalize that. That's certainly one that, whether it's the athletes themselves performing and having to do that when they go home to their families, the performance staffs, if we talk about the, high performing executives, it's a very similar thing. And it's one that's often talked about. And I think people, and even clients that I have, might tend to think they're almost better at it than they actually are. Like there's still a lot that's coming home with them. Is there, again, could you talk about the pitfalls of that, or again, some strategies that you might have to really be able to do better in that category?
Yeah, absolutely. I think here it helps to understand like what's going on biologically and psychologically. So after a game, we'll just use a sport example, but it could apply to anything, right? What happens is we've got all these stress hormones going crazy, right? Because we just performed or we just watched, our team perform or what have you. So we have like cortisol going through the roof. If we won, maybe we have more adrenaline. And it's really hard to like go from this high stress environment to then like, okay, I'm going to be, whoever at home. So, and we know this because cortisol tends to linger for hours. Adrenaline has a shorter half life; it's easier to get rid of, but cortisol tends to linger for a long time. So, what we need is some way to process that, both from a hormonal side, but also a psychological side, because they work in tandem here. Is if you've got all this stress going around, what happens is your brain goes on this like ruminating journey to be like, okay, how do I figure this out? And you're thinking about all the things that went right or went often what went wrong and what you're going to do about them and blah, 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 et cetera, et cetera. So I think the biggest thing is twofold is first, you need a process for making sense of and dealing with the thing, right? If you don't have a process, you're screwed. The second is, I think, if you look at the research, one of the best things you can do after these moments is have others who you can talk to about it right afterwards. Because what happens is when we're around other people, friends, family, teammates, just people who we generally enjoy, is we release more oxytocin, which then dampens down that cortisol. And
Yeah.
it shifts us from like a stress state into what I'd call like a, socialize and recover state. So our body starts to transition just because it's like, oh, we're hanging out with friends, we're having the post game meal or getting the, whatever drinks, whatever it is. And that starts to shift that state. So friends socializing A is number one. The other part I think in that process is like define it. So again, I'll use the physician example. Is I had some emergency room physicians who I worked with and talked to, and they told me it's like for them it was the car ride home.
Hmm.
So the car ride home when they left the hospital and drove home to their family, they were like, that was my time to process and think about what I just went through. And as soon as I opened up that garage, to put the car in, that's when I was like, okay, I'm done. And in their case, they would say, I'm done. And some of them would have like a literal notepad or use their phone to say, okay, what are the one or two things that I'm just gonna leave here?
Yeah.
Meaning they just write it down almost like symbolically of like this stays in the car so that I can transition. So
Yeah.
I think in whatever your life, it's like figuring out that process or that constraint that allows you to like switch hats or take your jersey off.
Yeah. It's amazing those who can really harness that skill, how they can have that high stress job and yet still be able to, sorry for the automated thumbs up there, and still be able to really transition. One thing that I've noticed from more and more executive clients who are now working from home is that the walk from the garden office or the third floor down the stairs to the kitchen is not the car ride. And I appreciate that the same strategy could work, but do you have any, offshoots of that could help in terms of, I mean, obviously going for a walk, things like that, but it does seem to it sort of highlights the value of what you've just said because it seems implicitly harder when you're literally in the same building and just moving from one floor to the next.
Yeah, absolutely. And the reason is, again, psychology tells us that our environment invites not only actions, but roles. So when we step into the arena, what happens? We adopt a role because our environment is inviting this. This is no different than if you go to church on Sunday. What happens? You don't act like the same person exactly as when you're watching the football games afterwards with your buddies, right?
Very
The
good point.
environment, yeah, the environment invites a role, and you, like, it's still you, but it's a part of you that says, like, I'm going to be more like this because everything is signaling that. At home, what happens? We don't have anything that signals that because
Hmm.
we're upstairs in our office or wherever you are. And then you walk outside and you're like, oh, I'm now in the kitchen or living room or like next to my daughter's room and she's screaming. So I think that's really important. And what I would say is twofold is when you look at your environment for your office or your workplace, like make it invite the kind of role you want to be in, right? Meaning like
Yeah.
a workspace, if you're a writer, a notebook there, like signal that, okay? And then and have that be different from the rest of your house, right? If you're fortunate to be able to have this. And then I think afterwards, it's okay, how do I realize I'm going to make a transition and leave whatever is here behind? And that could be as simple as having like a notebook, again, similar to the car idea of like, what are the, two or three things that I want to think about, that I'm going to leave here, or maybe even the two or three things I'm going to take forward so that I can work on it again tomorrow, right? And then the
Yeah.
other part of it, I think, is like having strict constraints. So a lot of times when we work at home, our work bleeds into everything. So we're not just working at it in the office, but we're thinking about that work while we're sitting, in the living room or sitting at dinner, with our kids and family. And I think figuring out how to transition to where you can like be focused and intentional on the next thing you're doing really helps us get out of that. So what I often tell, you know, um, people who work from home is when your workday ends and you leave that office, you need to have like a first activity that almost like demands you to be intentional. So maybe it's like leave the office and I'm going to go, straight into the kitchen and help prepare the salad or whatever it is
Do
for
the
dinner
dishes,
that
whatever.
night.
Yeah.
Do the dishes, but it's something where it's like, okay, I need to focus on this. And that helps give you that transition period that you often don't have.